from a multifamily perspective, the cost reductions in solar technology over the past 10 years have really driven down the cost of solar energy. And because of this, at a very basic level, the energy that you can get from a solar array on your building is a lot less expensive than the energy that you're buying from the utility.
Welcome to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can find all the buzz around multifamily housing. I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrett Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Each week, we'll bring you a guest or a topic in the multifamily housing industry that will help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Let's get started. Our guest today on the Buzz House is John Reinders, a senior project developer with a solar development company, Glow Solar. We're going to have a discussion with John about utilizing solar in your multifamily housing development. Before jumping into our discussion with John, we have a couple of items of industry news to give you updates on. HUD just released the operating cost adjustment factors for 2022, which is released on a state-by-state basis. OCAF, of course, is used for the annual rent increase in many Section 8 contracts. On average, for 2022, the increase is 3.1%, with a low of 1.8% in Hawaii and a high of 3.5% in California. So 3.1, on average over the years is a little bit higher than average. So those of you with Section 8 and looking at renewals, a pretty good increase overall. Next, the Internal Revenue Service issued Revenue Procedure 2021-39, which extends the availability of bond issuers to conduct hearings virtually through March 31st, 2022 due to COVID-19. Well, this procedure itself is maybe not, super exciting. I think what many in the industry find interesting is we are looking for the IRS if they will come out with further extensions for items such as place and service dates, 10% tests, various compliance items related to COVID, as they did at the end of 2020. So we're looking if the IRS will come out with a similar extension. So we'll keep you up to date on any further word from the IRS on extensions. HUD published its annual list of areas that qualify as qualified census tracts or QCTs and difficult to develop areas or DDAs for purposes of the Housing Credit Program. Of course, properties located in these areas are eligible for up to the 30% basis boost if they receive an allocation of credits after December 31st, 2021, or for bond finance properties if the bonds are issued and the project is placed in service after December 31st, 2021. Our recommendation, if you're working on putting a project together right now, is if it's in a QCT or DDA, check the 2022 list. And if it's not, there may be some strategies. For example, if you have a bond application that's going in to preserve your basis boost, reach out to Garrick and I with any questions on possible ways to preserve that basis boost. Lastly, one other note related to our conversation on solar today is there was recently a bill introduced in the House, which is geared to increasing solar panel manufacturing jobs. The Solar Energy Manufacturing for America Act would provide tax credits at every stage of the solar manufacturing supply chain. So we're going to talk a little bit, about those solar panels and solar on your multifamily. This is actually looking at the solar manufacturing supply chain. Now with that, I'm very excited to jump into our conversation with John, and I'm going to turn it over to Garrick.
Thanks, Don. And John, thanks for joining our podcast. Before we get into some questions, why don't you go ahead and start out by letting our listeners know a little bit about Glow Solar and your role with the company.
Sure, of course. Hi, Garrick. Hi, Don. Thanks for having me on the show. Glow Solar is a turnkey solar developer, and we specialize in commercial, residential, and agricultural PV systems. Our goal is to provide the best value and customer service in the industry. In my role at Glow, I help customers evaluate their energy usage. I help design solar systems for their facilities or their homes. And I also help them secure grants or financing or almost anything else they might need to achieve their particular goal. Each customer and each facility is unique, and it keeps it interesting.
Thanks for that intro. I'd like to go ahead and start our discussion, John, but before we get in, obviously, we'll start off with the obvious. So what are the tangible benefits of adding solar to your multifamily building is kind of the question we want to ask, but would you be able to start with addressing the actual benefits to the annual electricity costs and also that rate stability into the future? Just sort of give context as we get into this conversation.
Sure. This is a great way to start the conversation. Cost reduction, rate stability, the financial implications of going solar often are what bring people to the table. It's interesting to see how you can control your costs. It's interesting to see what you could do to sort of shave your monthly bills. And so from a multifamily perspective, the cost reductions in solar technology over the past 10 years have really, really driven down the cost of solar energy. And because of this, at a very basic level, the energy that you can get from a solar array on your building is a lot less expensive than the energy that you're buying from the utility. So, for example, if you're buying energy for your building from a utility, maybe it's 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Whereas the energy from a solar array might only be 2 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So at a very basic level, you can see where those savings come from.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. That's a good way to sort of start this conversation, I think, because obviously we have a lot of developers, et cetera, that are building new apartment buildings on this podcast who listen to it. And so for them, so when you're developing a new apartment building, is there a specific, or what is the best time to plan to actually put solar on there from a timing perspective? I know you could do it up front, but I presume you could also have construction complete and then possibly add it afterwards. So is that something maybe you can discuss and give some context around sort of the timing issues?
Sure. So when you're building a building and it's a new construction, obviously it makes sense to incorporate the various features that you want to include in the building, right? So if you can plan for things like a little bit extra weight on the roof, if you can plan to leave space on the roof by grouping your HVAC units in certain areas, or by designing the building in such a way that you're not shading the big areas that you might want to use for solar, you can save yourself a lot of headache later down the road. Oftentimes when we're looking to add solar to an existing facility or an existing building, we have obstructions like parapet walls or little additional rooms that contain other items like, I don't know, elevator shafts, things like that. And those things can get in the way of making it easy to do solar. So obviously, if you can plan for it, it's great. You can run the conduit while you're doing some of your other electrical work. You can beef up some of the rafters if you need to, and you can leave room in your electrical room or your area where you're going to have your meter so that you can put the inverters there. So you can make things easier for yourself, but you can also retrofit after the fact. Sometimes it's a little bit more straightforward to retrofit a solar system on an existing building because at least at that point you have a really good idea of what your usage is and how much you're paying for your power. So it can be a little bit more straightforward modeling what your savings actually are going to end up being.
Good. That was good insight, John. A question, John, so again, almost all of our clients are, developing, building, renovating apartment buildings. Is there a bad candidate for solar? Is every single apartment building, is it, where I'm facing towards the sun, the geography? Is it, if I'm in the Midwest or the East Coast? I mean, even a rule of thumb, or should someone just reach out to a solar developer like yourself just to ask the question?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Now, if you are say you have a building that's maybe 3 stories tall and right next to you are a whole bunch of 10-story buildings and you're in the shade all the time, you're probably not a great candidate for solar. But there are a lot of complicating factors in the sense that, yes, it's ideal to have southern exposure, but you can still use eastern or western exposure. You can still get quite a bit of sun that way. So I guess the short answer is it probably makes sense to give somebody like me a call and just to take a quick look. I can look at a building in relatively quick order, figure out if it makes any sense at all. If you have tons of stuff on the roof, if you have a ton of shade, or if your building is not in great shape, or maybe your roof condition is not ideal, those are other things that can play into it.
That's good. And I think we'll keep that in mind that just really any new project, again, unless it's maybe buried in the inner city somewhere, might be, we can run it by someone like you, John. John, like you might have been touched on a little bit earlier, is that there's probably solar, right? It's kind of, are there credits? I know we've talked in the past, there's credits. Sometimes I'm sure there's state grants and things like that. What are some of the general types of financing credits that you've seen around solar projects?
Sure, good question. The biggest incentive probably out there right now is the We call it the ITC, or the federal income tax credit. That's where the ITC comes from. And this credit is currently 26% of the cost of the system. So if it's a $100,000 system, it's a $26,000 credit. So that's kind of the biggest single incentive out there right now. Additionally, there's accelerated depreciation that you can use. And so those two things combined, it's almost half the cost of the solar system. But that's also assuming that you've got the tax appetite to take that tax credit, right? So that can be complicated for somebody who's a nonprofit or a government entity, or somebody who doesn't simply have that appetite. Sometimes they can't use that tax credit. But there are other incentives out there as well. Here in Wisconsin, there's the Focus on Energy program, which is a utility-funded incentive program. At the federal level, there's the USDA Rural Energy for America program. It's called REAP, is the acronym. And that one is a grant for rural areas. If you are in a rural zip code, or basically not in a large city, there's quite a bit of grant funding that can be available there. And even at the local level, here in Madison, there's a $5,000 Madison grant, which is available for commercial solar installations. So that's part of what makes my job interesting, is figuring out, where is this project, what incentives are available, how do we get them, and how can we get sort of all the incentives available for that particular project. And then additionally, I should mention, there's sort of more traditional financing available from banks. There's lots of banks that are happy to finance a solar system. And then there's also kind of an interesting, relatively new concept, the property assessed clean energy loans. PACE is the acronym for those. And these are long-term loans that often can be 20 to 25 years long. And the idea behind them is that your savings on energy will equal or exceed the cost of servicing that debt. So that can be an option for somebody who maybe doesn't want to take out a standard loan, or is looking for a way to finance it without any money out of pocket.
Yeah, thanks for that insight. I mean, so we kind of touched on the financing mechanisms and the subsidies that are out there, and even the great candidates. So assuming a project is ready to go with solar, so can you touch on the cost benefit relationship here? Like, does your company help determine, in other words, the optimal amount of panels that will be needed for a project?
Yeah, thanks, Garrick. Great question. And that's actually one of the main things that I do, is try to determine what makes the most sense for this individual client in this individual building. So for example, you could have a multifamily building with perfect roof, tons of space, and just looks like the best place to put a whole bunch of solar modules, right? But maybe they don't use that much energy. And so in that case, we're going to only put as many modules up on the roof as they need to meet their energy needs. Another thing that it could be is maybe they use a ton of power, but they have a ton of obstructions. And so we may use more expensive, more powerful modules because we don't have as much room. Whereas if we have a ton of room, we could maybe use less powerful, less expensive modules. And then in addition, there's other things that can affect the return on investment with a solar array, because there's different policies from the utility level, or there's, so for example, there's a term people use called net metering. And the idea with net metering is that if I'm buying energy from the utility at a certain rate, and my solar system is maybe making more energy than I'm using on a particular day, the idea is they'll pay me the same amount that I'm paying them, so as the meter rolls forward and backwards, it's the same rate. Now, there's a limit on net metering. Different utilities have different limits. So if I'm in an area where there's a low net metering limit, we may not want to build the biggest solar array that fits on that roof, because we won't be able to get the full value for it. So there are a lot of things that go into it. And again, that's what makes it interesting.
John, we got good info as well. As Garrick and I were preparing for this, we kind of were talking about that, like how many modules I think you mentioned are there. And so the one last question, John, is there, I'm sure it seems like there's always some kind of solar going on in state legislation or federal legislation. Is there a wish list among, kind of the solar industry Is it maybe, I know the solar credit I think was 30%, it's now to 26, like you said. Are there any wish list legislative items out there that you're aware of or kind of watch or monitor?
Oh, yeah. I mean, solar's been in the news a lot, right? There's at the federal level, there's infrastructure bills that have been bouncing around. Some of the proposals contained in there, like a carbon tax or further credits, some of those things could make a big impact. Or even like at a more local level in Illinois, they just passed another big energy bill, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And this is going to provide a whole bunch of funding for solar projects of all sizes and types. And so it would be nice to get to a point where we aren't so dependent on different incentives and sort of different supports. But as it is, the sort of the legacy power systems that we have from, however long we've been building our infrastructure, they've got a big head start. And so things like a carbon tax, things like net metering policies that are more generous, things like renewable energy credits, these things could have a big impact. And if I knew exactly what was coming down the line, I would love it. But the sad reality is that we kind of have to wait and see what actually happens with those various pieces of legislation and everything else. One other thing that's interesting, though, I would mention is the whole sort of drive to electrify everything. I think that could have some significant impacts for solar because, and even particularly solar on multifamily, because there's a lot of people that are going to be looking to plug in their car. And people developing multifamily are going to have to take that into account. And if you can offset some of those electrical costs by adding solar, it might make a ton of sense. So I'm looking forward to that. There's actually quite a few people that I've been talking to that have been mentioning adding car chargers.
Good. That's really good insight, John. And yeah, that car charger, we've seen some articles around that as well. So really, with that, we really want to thank John for joining the Buzz House today, and listeners, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you for listening to Buzz House. To receive a notification when new episodes are available, please subscribe to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. And if you have a suggested topic, please send them to build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD@bakertilly.com.